I'm glad to announce it's no longer to notice the costs of mass migration. You're not going to be called a racist if you do it. I wonder if anyone was saying this for absolutely years now. But thank you to Neil O'Brien MP and to Robert Jenrick MP, former immigration minister, for giving us a 100-page report pointing at the blindingly obvious that it's bankrupting the country. Speaking of spending money, if you want to come and work for us and you have the prerequisite qualifications, go and look at our careers page on the website. We have a production manager job. This is for the one in Swindon, correct?
No, we've had enough applications though. This is the one in London.
Southeast London. So if you are in Southeast London and can commute there, go and look at the specifications and send in an application if it's suitable. But if you're wondering what I'm talking about, well, there are two things that happened this past week concerning illegal migration. The first one is Andrea Jenkins MP had a debate in Parliament on the costs of illegal migration because she did some research into it. And she said, and this is a quote, "Even the most basic calculation puts the economic burden on the British taxpayers for an illegal migration population of 1.2 million at 14.4 billion, just shy of the 10% of NHS England's budget for this year. Imagine that as a cash injection for our National Health Service, or, something slightly more useful," she told the Westminster Hall
Just reduce
debate.
my taxes, god damn it.
Yeah, you could just stop stealing money from us to send to nuclear-armed Pakistan for climate reparations or something like that. In addition, she pointed out the Home Office expects to spend 482 million on immigration enforcement just this year alone, despite 50 to 100,000 people sneaking through the channel. Fantastic. Along with almost 8 million a day in accommodation for those who have crossed the channel in dinghies. I think that number's actually been revised higher according to the Labour Party statistics that looked at the Home Office spending. They said it's at least 10 million now. So,
brilliant.
Yep. I'm really glad the Conservative estimate is just 2 million a day off for Tom, Dick and Abdul sneaking into the country. The government is also giving out 370 million to Rwanda in its flagship deportation scheme, and will give 476 million in handouts to the French so they can help stopping the Channel Cross boats. The French decided to spend that on the fence for a private football stadium, last I checked. Great use of our money as well. For those who don't realise as well, I think Harry mentioned this yesterday, one flight to Rwanda was taken off and we paid him a £3,000 stipend to do it, and if he commits a crime while he's there, while we're paying for his bed and board, he gets sent straight back.
I got nothing to say. It's just ridiculous on the face of it. You'd never agree to any kind of contract or deal that had terms like this in advance. You would never sign anything. It's just absurd. We're just the leakiest ship in the world. We're just pouring money out everywhere, and we wonder why the country is degrading.
There are two risks here as well, and so obviously this is all true, and this is lamentable, and many people have been sounding this
for years,
drum for many years. But the first thing as well is that we're talking about a very small segment of immigration to this country. We're exclusively talking about illegal, and so there are two concerns I have with that. For one, legal is much higher, and the second thing as well is that even though there's a tendency for people to be a little bit too comprehensive in their take that immigration is fiscally burdensome, that's actually not the case when you segment inflows into this country in ways which are not necessarily very politically correct. So, for example, EU immigrants, like European EEA immigrants, overwhelmingly make a net fiscal contribution to this country. Non-EU immigrants, and this has been replicated in studies in Denmark and in Holland, and recently I read one by the Oxford Migration Observatory, which is based in this country, is also incredibly fiscally burdensome. And we've had a lot more of those people coming in over the last 4 years, since Brexit, frankly, than we have had these illegal immigrants who, yes, admittedly are fiscally burdensome, but this is only a fraction of it, really.
These are the MENATs that Harry and Callum were mentioning yesterday. In the
Middle Eastern, North African, and what's the T?
Troublesome? But you're right. Like the illegal migration debate is essentially a smokescreen for the mass legal migration that has been conducted by the Conservative Party since they have pledged since 1992 to bring numbers down to the tens of thousands.
Moreover, just on that, there isn't really much of a debate here. I mean, everyone agrees that illegal immigrants shouldn't be here, apart from a few NGOs who are paid to say that they should. So it's not even a debate that's being used as a smokescreen for the actual debate, which is the legal migration.
Exactly. And by the way, when it talks about here about costs, there are far more than purely fiscal costs to this inflow, and we all know that, of course.
Well, that's the conversation that both you and I have had with Eric Kaufman about his book White Shift, where lots of people have felt the need to coach their objections to immigration in purely fiscal terms to avoid the cudgel of racism, when actually ethnocultural terms and continuity in demographics are warranted concerns, and people shouldn't be chased away from that.
Yes, I'd rather have sort of 50 years of not very enjoyable deficits than statelessness.
Yes.
But also, it's
when you put it like that,
it's the premise that, okay, even if we could flat pack build human battery farms ad infinitum and upgrade the sewage system and have enough NHS stuff, do I want Infinity Africans in the country? Because they're telling themselves a story in which we are the villain.
Tom Harwood says yes.
Well, quite. At the risk of being maximally controversial in these sorts of circles as well, and I expect many of the viewers, and maybe even you two, might disagree with me on this. I actually would, not for the reasons that are commonly wheeled out by people like Alistair Campbell or Rory Stewart, but I would vote to remain now in 2016
Really?
if I got the chance again.
Hugely controversial, I would say now.
Well, and the reason for that, Carl, is because I think it should have been predictable to people like us in advance that even though we would be repatriating powers to Westminster, those were not going to be used those were going to be the main beneficiaries of those powers being repatriated. Given the personnel in the Brexit project, people like Gove, people like Johnson, that project was always going to get hijacked by globalist drones, which is now why we have tilted our immigration system overwhelmingly away from EU immigrants who are A, make net fiscal contributions, B, much more likely to return home, and C, have no incentive to support anti-white identity politics. And we tilted our immigration system post-Brexit in the name of global Britain into being completely the opposite to that. So in a perfect world, I would be conceptually in favor of leaving the European Union, because I think that I believe in sovereignty. I believe in self-determination. I want those powers repatriated. I think the European Communities Act was and is a disgrace. But given the situation in which we found ourselves in 2016, and given the political personnel that really did exist in the real world in Westminster, it would have been prudent for us to realize that the demographic foundations of sovereignty matter a lot more than the sort of constitutional de jure foundations of sovereignty. And I think we obsessed too much, Jacob Rees-Mogg style, over restoring Dicey's constitution. We cared much more about that than we did about the demographic foundations, which are truly decisive when it comes to being a sovereign country.
The reason I don't agree is just because France, Germany, and Italy are all faring absolutely no better on the Middle East and North African migrant question. So I do think they still would have set up some kind of pact where we got, quote unquote, our fair share.
But that's exclusive. Well, not necessarily. I don't know enough about the domestic situations in those two countries, but my understanding is that we're talking overwhelmingly there about Angela Merkel's Wir schaffen das. We can do this. Let's bring them all in 2015. Like, that is the crisis which was precipitated there, and that was a sovereign decision made by Angela Merkel. I grant you that we would have a lot of those people would in 5 years' time, if they're given German passports, would have had the right to come here.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't have been anything like as astronomical as it has been under Boris Johnson.
No, but the main thrust of the complaint seems to be that the cure is worse than the disease, which is fair, but I feel like it might be slightly short-term thinking, because yes, things are bad now, but I think that actually what we're seeing is the ship turning around in all of this, in fact. And so, yes, right now things are bad, but in 10 years' time, I think if we're lucky, we'll have the kind of Britain that we'd want going in at least the right direction, and being free from the EU. I do take the validity of your complaint as well, because it is, in retrospect, Boris was not hiding the fact that this was going to happen. I guess no one really thought it was going to.
Well, yeah, the clue was always, and this is what I've said before, and another thing is be very suspicious when people who want to frame themselves for obvious political reasons as restrictionist on immigration use the word control immigration as opposed to drastically reduce. And if you study, obviously in the manifesto in the end, he did put in, we will dramatically, I think, bring down immigration in 2019. But he and Gove were also always couching in terms of control.
Yeah.
And I think that's that. We shouldn't fall too easily for that sovereigntist move, because while sovereignty is important, what matters a lot more is what you do with it. And if you exercise sovereignty in order to increase the possibility that your own people will be stateless in 40 years' time, that's not any kind of sovereignty I want any business.
I mean, he was under control. He was in control of it, and
indeed.
Look what he did. You are right there.
Yeah. Hopefully, it just means that we're easy to throw off the shackles of the things like the ECHR and the like in future. So
it could have that boon in the future.
Yeah.
I'm aware of, but I'm just saying I'm listening. But sorry, I don't want to be too self-promoting, but I wrote a piece recently called "A Warning Against Anglo-Triumphalism," which goes into this, and I'm just more ambivalent and I feel less vindicated about Brexit than I did say 2020 or 2019. I feel like I'm a little bit more ambivalent about it.
I think the issue is really just the people who were chosen to hold the reins during the process.
Yeah.
The Conservatives are just abominable.
Indeed.
Structure matters less than having our friends in power. And speaking of which, let's see someone's bid for the Conservative leadership, because that's almost exactly what this is from Robert Jenrick. So Robert Jenrick being the former immigration minister, who I have heard for like a year plus now, basically since Liz Truss appointed him, that he's, quote, on our side.
And maybe he is.
Interesting. But as per usual, nothing gets done by ministers when it comes to the Home Office. I mean, we've had recently letters of threatening legal action from the Home Office saying they won't enforce the Rwanda deportation rules. So unless you clear out all of Whitehall, nothing's going to happen on that particular front. And he wrote it with Neil O'Brien as well, who I still can't forgive for compiling lists of quote-unquote COVID conspiracy theorists, which contained people as dangerous as Julie Hartley-Brewer and Toby Young. There's far-right conspiracy theorists.
I like being on this, sir.
Yeah.
That was purely a smear campaign, I think, to ingratiate himself with Johnson at the time, and it was disgraceful. Very, very depressing period in our history. That.
Yeah, but since he's been useful on embarrassing the fact that the Department for Work and Pensions, the Home Office, and just aren't collecting data, which is inconvenient to the mass migration narrative.
Yeah.
So this will be interesting to see how this goes forward, particularly when the Conservatives lose the election and everyone's scrambling for the leadership role. But because Callum mentioned the report in passing yesterday, I want to go through some of the stats just to properly arm you guys with future arguments and rebuttals. Whenever some midwit on Question Time says that immigration is an unmitigated good for the economy, no. Even though we've slightly evaded a recession this year, it's not because of record mass migration, right? So here's some quotes. I'll scroll down to pages 4 and 5 because that's most.
So just quickly, okay. So we had to bring in 1.4 million to get a 0.1% increase in growth. That is a horrifically bad proportion. I think maybe concealing other problems.
Quite. So it says, since 2010, 10 million people have moved to the UK and 6.3 million left, meaning net migration has added 3.7 million people to the population. That's the equivalent of the populations of Edinburgh, Leeds, Sheffield, Nottingham, Stoke, Bristol and Cardiff put together, or more than the entire population of Wales.
It's also understating the numbers, but...
Well, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, quite, because they also don't necessarily add the million plus illegal people that they say are here as well.
Absolutely. There are definitely at least 1 to 2 million more illegals, but probably more than that, to be honest.
Yes. So migration added a city the size of Birmingham, 1.2 million people, to the UK in just 2 years. That equates to population growth of 1.8%. Legal inflows, the subject of this paper, are over 25 times the level of illegal inflows, 1.2 million versus 46,000 in 2022, but those are still going up.
The good framing. Very good framing.
Yeah.
The correct framing.
This is why people have been saying that they might have been listening to us.
Yes.
Or at least
good lads.
The parliamentary assistants who are also covertly writing this paper, because I have run into some other parliamentary assistants, including this week, who are keen watchers of our show. So we do have friends in some decent places.
I need to get a plug in it. It's also true as well that Rafe, in particular, the New Culture Forum, Rafe Heidelman-Koo, but well worth following on Twitter. One of our seniors. Oh, really? Excellent. That's that very good guest selection there. He's spoken in the past about how he's rather suspicious. He'll say something, ever so slightly spicy on the NCF's weekly Newspeak show, and then 4 weeks later, Liz Truss or Suella Braverman says something similar. These people do have their ear to the ground.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I just wish they had their brain attached to their ear sometimes.
Yes.
God bless them. Excluding outflows of British citizens, net migration from 1964 to 1997 averaged 55,000 a year, whereas since 1997, when something happened, it averaged 316,000 per year, well over 5 times the average rate in the previous period. Bear in mind, that's the average for the Blair and Brown years as well. The Tories have basically doubled that, so they're far more radical than even Blair had in his wildest
And they've
dreams.
radically changed the composition as well, which is vital.
Quite. But in 2021 and 2022, under a new system, which is Boris Johnson's system, 290,000 people came from the EU and 1.64 million from the rest of the world. And that's the composition
there we go.
argument. Yeah. In addition, according to estimates published by the Migration Observatory in September 2020, there are perhaps between 800,000 and 1.2 million immigrants living here without permission. So illegals just occupying either from visa overstays or breaking in via the channel. Now, he notes that Blair abolished exit checks in 1998, so we can't quite know how many people are net outflowing. But he says, after exit checks were reinstated for a time, 2 years of data showed that of the 10 million people whose right to remain in the UK had expired, there was no evidence of departure for over 600,000 of them. So it's about, 5% retention rate? If that rate has been consistent over the decades, then there is potentially thousands or even millions of extra people we don't know about. Do you remember when Richard Tice kicked out Bowe from Reform UK for saying there might be millions of people here since 1997 who have no right to stay and should be deported? And Richard was like, we can't deport all the people that have legally settled here. No, there might be well over 1 million people since 1997 who have settled here illegally. That's just the numbers. Should have been Reform Party policy.
I mean, if in 2 years we have 600,000 people unaccounted for who should have left but haven't, and we just extrapolate that reasonably compared to a proportion of the inflow that had come in, you are going to have millions of extra people.
And we have to extrapolate that reasonably because they say here, the net migration projections that fed into the OBR's modelling, the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, processed by the Office for National Statistics, have been consistently and significantly wrong. Excluding COVID, the annual outturn has exceeded projection migration 93% of the time, and not by small amounts. On average, projected numbers fell 28% fall of the eventual outturn in the first year and 51% by the fifth year. In other words, the ONS migration projections used by the OBR to set Treasury policy have turned out to be too low by hundreds of thousands of migrants per annum.
Oh, really?
And by millions across the forecast period. So I remember when going to Conservative Party conference and some jumped up fellow, I think it was for the Adam Smith Institute or the IEA, said that if the Treasury Green Book says we need 200,000 people a year to maintain GDP, we need 200,000 people a year. And it's like, right, so you're going by the Treasury Green Book, which is consistently wrong in the modelling, and you're wondering why we're bankrupt.
Is that really true? Because these people also overwhelmingly support Liz Truss's policy prospectus, and Liz Truss isn't exactly sanguine about the OBR and these blob-like institutions which uphold the economic orthodoxy. So you can't have it both ways. You can't be ultra critical of them when they say that your fiscal plans don't make any sense, and rely on them in order to turbocharge immigration.
You can if you're an idiot.
Well, quite.
The Home Office's impact assessment for EU settlement scheme post-Brexit estimated that between 3.5 and 4.1 million EU nationals are in the UK and would be eligible. But a much larger number, 5.7 million people, now received a grant settlement. So the understanding of the authors of the paper of how many people who come into the UK was about 50% out. Brilliant. Wonder how we're spending so much money. Between 2001 and 2021, the share of people in England and Wales born outside the UK increased from 9% to 17%. This is higher than the US, despite the perception of America as a melting pot. US is 14%, by the way.
Yeah.
In 2022, the ONS predicted the UK population would hit 70 million in 2036. It now predicts this will happen a decade earlier in 2026.
Yeah.
Completely unprecedented rate of demographic change, never seen before in any country in history.
But also, as Harrison was pointing out, it's actually worth becoming more granular on these things, because immigration is, of course, not equally spread across the constituent nations of the United Kingdom. If you take England and Wales in isolate, there are about 60 million known people in England and Wales, 25% of which are not English or Welsh.
Yeah.
So, and the same is not true in Scotland or in Northern Ireland.
Much to the chagrin of the late Hamza Yusuf, so to speak.
Well, yeah, yes, exactly. But we have had this quite rapidly, and this is why the protests in Ireland are very important, because the Irish are basically speed running what has happened to England.
Yes.
And this is why the Irish progressives are like, oh no, the Irish nationalists are funded by the British. Like, no, we're just very sympathetic.
Indeed.
We know exactly how it works and what happens to you, and so. Shouldn't stand for
and Ireland benefits in that speed running massively benefits from the fact that it doesn't have a post-imperial guilt complex. It also benefits from the fact that they have a plausible claim to 200 years or so of progressive nationalism. So nationalism can be progressive in Ireland because they're an underdog nation as opposed to a domineering one, and therefore it's
liberatory.
Exactly, yeah, and also. But I think Celtic nationalism is very, very, very demented at the moment, because you've got, on the one hand,
that's true.
At the moment,
it's
historically it made sense.
It made sense when you're using,
not with the Scots always.
When you're no, that's true. That's true. Like there's a lot of. I mean, there's
in the prior century when they were allying with.
Sure. But it at least makes sense for the sort of ethnic autonomy of the Irish or the Scottish. You can
when it's united by hatred of the English, that makes sense. Not saying I agree with it, but because I'm part Scottish myself and I like both the English and the Scots, it makes sense. You're right, though, that Scottish nationalism has always been a bit sus because look, there's a reason why the second city in Malawi is called Blantyre. It's because the Scots were massive beneficiaries from British imperial expansion.
They were a part of it.
Of course they were. They spearheaded it, and in a way
they were disproportionately part of the army.
Certainly, and in a way that
part of the slave trade, actually.
In a way that the Irish didn't, and so that's very dishonest. Trying to the way Nicola Sturgeon will sort of blot that out of the Scottish history curriculum is very, very, very cynical. Yeah,
well, to get more granular, so they say here between 2001 and 2021, the proportion of the population who do not identify as white British more than doubled from 12.5 to 25.6. And unlike some Tory politicians, I do actually care about that, because again, if people tell themselves a particular story, they don't stop telling themselves that story about their history and their culture and their ethnic, tribal, and religious baggage the moment they're dropped on British soil and have their passport rubber stamped and the like.
Important as well, just say that doesn't mean brown either. That's millions of Europeans as well.
And it would include white Irish too.
Yeah. In East Ham, for example, to illustrate the point, the first language of 73% of pupils is not English. There are certain areas of London where nearly 3/4 of the children born do not speak English as a first language, or proficiently, if at all. So, talking on the employment and the economy, because obviously this is the purpose of the paper, they say, and this is page 44, in the modern era of large-scale, relatively low-skilled net migration, GDP per capita growth has actually stagnated, as this graph indicates. So,
Really?
this is the housing stock one, I believe. Correlation is not causation, of course, but if the large-scale migration of the sort we've seen is so good for the economy, we have to ask ourselves, why are we not seeing this GDP per capita data? According to the OECD, the fiscal impact of the cumulative waves of migration that arrived over the past 50 years in countries, including the UK, is on average close to zero, rarely exceeding 0.5% of GDP in either positive or negative terms. So, all the technological innovation since the 1970s that should have caused a productivity revolution has essentially been wiped out by the Middle Eastern and North African migrants who are net dependents on the economy.
It's very interesting, though, how the debate has changed. And so you weren't there, Carl, but Connor and I were recently at a debate in Westminster. It was at the Emmanuel Centre, and I think it would have been between Konstantin Kisin and Matt Goodwin,
Polly Toynbee and Aaron Bastani
on immigration is good for Britain, or immigration has been good for Britain, or something. And it was very interesting, like when you compare the sort of excuses for immigration that people like Blair and, well, indeed people like Toynbee would wheel out in the early 2000s, they wouldn't just be, it would be ultra triumphalist. It would be, this is going to turbocharge GDP. This is good for us. It enriches us culturally, it enriches us fiscally. That's gone. What they do now, and it's very different, is that they basically say that we have developed a crippling dependency on immigration, and that's why it's good for us. Which is a little bit like saying
the heroin addict benefits. I'm really going to suffer if you take away my heroin.
If you take away his heroin, he might die. Ergo, the heroin is clearly good for him. There's a similar
the withdrawals will be too painful.
Indeed, and that's a massive concession that they're making to us, and it means that we should wean ourselves off these crippling habits that we've developed structurally in this country. And Matt Goodwin was very good at hammering that point home at the debate.
Especially so, when you look into the statistics, they say out of the net migration of 2 million non-EU nationals over the last 5 years, that complete shift in composition of migrants after Brexit, 15% came to work.
Yeah. Yes.
So no, it's not a benefit.
We are literally importing dependents.
Yes, 85% are dependents.
Yeah, you had a statistic as well. I remember we spoke about it afterwards about social care in particular. The idea that our social care sector and the NHS in particular, the NHS and our social care sector in particular are just completely dependent on immigrants. It's actually much lesser than you think.
So Miriam Cates wheeled this out in a parliamentary debate. They handed out 70,000 social care visas last year, and only 17,000 places were filled.
Well, the ethnic breakdown of the NHS is actually public knowledge. The NHS is only about a third
28% in this.
Yeah, about a third non-British. And so, okay, but the country is nearly a third non-British.
Quite.
So for themselves.
Exactly. So this is actually quite proportional.
And there's also no obligation as well. And I don't at all mean this in a heartless way. I actually mean this in a very sincere and humane way. There's no, you don't need to devalue what it means to be a citizen of this country by instantly giving these people citizenship. You can just, if you really do need like guest workers, so to speak, you can house them in perfectly, if they are going to be making a net fiscal contribution precisely because they do work in something like the social care sector, even if during the kind of weaning the junkie off his happy powder period, there's no reason why you can't have some of those workers in and not make them citizens, give them indefinite leave to remain, which means that if they do end up causing trouble, or if their children do, or whatever it might be, you're in a much stronger position to make clear distinctions between the host population and the guest, and you can expel the guest if they start behaving in ways which are deleterious to the self-determination rights and cultural coherence of the host population.
There's even a term we can use to describe them. Ancient Athenian democracy had a class of people called metics, who were the foreigners who worked in Athens because it was a prosperous and productive place.
And crucially not slaves, different from slaves.
Not slaves, they were completely free, but they just were not involved in the political system because they weren't citizens.
And there wasn't a pretense that they would, and that they would, and there wasn't a pretense that they would feel as strong an ancestral connection to Athens as someone like Plato would.
Of course, they were there for economic reasons, and everyone accepted that. That was the deal, and that worked.
Yeah. So I wanted to just get onto housing before we have to wrap up. So in London, they say the growth of the population accounted for by migration was greater than the growth of the housing stock. Surprise, surprise. Making that upward pressure even sharper. 67% of private rented households in the capital are headed by someone born overseas. So it's 47% of social housing is occupied by someone who's foreign born, but 67% of the total rented housing stock is occupied by someone who's foreign born.
And this is privately rented or
Yes. Yes.
Oh,
Yes. And then
but still,
I think
It's just mental.
they said it's 89% of the total demand for housing that's been driven in the last how many years has been driven solely by mass migration.
Yeah. And this was predictable. That's the problem. It was obviously predictable that if we allow in millions of new people, then house prices are going to go through the roof.
The laws of supply and demand don't cease to exist just because you're in a cosmopolitan mood.
But it was also predictable that wages would stagnate. Okay, we're bringing in millions of low-skilled workers to compete with the native British workers at that level. Well, obviously, it's going to depress their wages through competition.
It's a commodity like any other.
Exactly. It is. And the thing is, I'm not an economist, but I know these things because this is the most tried and tested economic theory that you can explain these things to a child and a child will understand, and it's just crazy how finally, in the year of our Lord 2024, we're finally getting MPs to be like, yeah, hey guys, turns out that didn't work.
The raw numbers themselves, right? to accommodate for the numbers of migration, levels of net migration for the last few years, they needed to build 3.44 million homes.
But they only built 200,000 a year, didn't they? Yeah.
So that was 2.25 million to meet underlying demand pressures. Translation: all the people we brought in. Sorry, the other one. So that's 2.25 million to cater for the native population, and 1.19 million to cope with net migration. So they only increased the number of homes by 2.11 million. So that's a deficit of 1.34 million homes, with net migration in effect accounting for 89% of the deficit.
Yeah.
Great, fantastic. From 2012 to 2022, net migration added 2.92 million to the population of England. Given the average household size of 2.3, that's 1.3 million households in England alone, an average increase of about 6%. So that added 12% to the house prices, according to the modelling. So, yeah, 12% unnecessary addition to the house prices, which were already going up because of inflation and rising interest rates.
Yeah.
Isn't that just wonderful?
But does that sufficiently explain why the house prices have on average gone from 4 times annual salary to 12 times annual salary?
No.
Yeah. So I appreciate that inflation is a major issue, but I think that understating the effect that immigration has had on the house price increase.
There's also a libertarian argument which tends to want to get its oar in here, to the effect that, well, what we need to do clearly is just have a bonfire of NIMBY housing regulations, and although that might on a purely spreadsheet level compensate for some of the laws of supply and demand which we're seeing manifest here, the question is that what would people's communities actually be like if they're subjected to the kind of property developers dictatorship, effectively, that libertarians would want to inflict on us.
And it's become apparent. There was a TikTok trend recently of people from overseas going around English houses and going, wow, these are really bad quality houses. It's become apparent that we aren't living in particularly great houses, even with the regulations. So
part of the reason is the best new houses, and I'll finish on this, are being given to people just born abroad. For example, they put the famous chart in here, something that we've actually spoken about on the podcast before.
This is in their report.
This is in their report.
72% of Somalians are living in social housing. Is that what they're saying here?
Yes. Yeah, it turns out, and then if you go down, it's about 60% of other Africans, and then Jamaicans, Ghanaians, Afghanistan, North Africa. Look at United Kingdom. It's basically middle of the pack in our own country.
Sorry, can we scroll down to the bottom just see what the number on that is? Right, so 18% of British of social housing goes to British people. Is that what they're saying there?
Yes.
Jesus.
Yeah. Pretty surprising.
No,
proportion of the population.
Yeah.
90% of British people
people are in social housing.
Yes. But
still,
per capita,
that's still crazy.
Somalians, 72%.
Look, it could be like, for all I care, the United Kingdom could be literally at the top, and Somalia could be second. I'd still be pissed off.
Well, I was about to top that.
Yeah, no single foreign person should be housed at my expense.
0% of foreigners should be eligible for social housing in Britain.
However, whether they're Kiwi or Somali.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't care if you come from France, Canada, Italy, United States, India, or Somalia. 0%.
Well, our London mayor cares about who's in social housing because he's building brand new social housing, and he's planning it around building it near mosques and halal butchers.
I wonder why.
So I'm just going to finish on this little clip from Sadiq Khan.
Islamic faith is the issue of housing. And so we need to build far more homes in our city because, often people from minority communities want to live near a mosque, near halal food, near places where there are other people like them. So they for a variety of obvious reasons. And they're priced out because there's not enough housing. So we're going to build at least 40,000 council homes, at least 6,000 rent control homes. And the final thing to say in relation to Londoners who are Muslim is, look, one of our strengths is our diversity. It's something I'm really proud of.
Diversity here meaning non-white, of course.
Always meaning non-white.
Yeah, it would be absolutely terrible if the English would prefer to live around people just like them and have their local butchers and their local churches, wouldn't it, Sadiq? So congratulations to Jenrick and O'Brien for putting out this report that tells us the blindingly obvious if we just open our curtains. But I appreciate the attempt to change the narrative, fellas. Issue is, though, because the Tory party has been so crap and lost pretty much every local council and London and most of the mayoral seats, they're still going to be building local social housing for their ethnic clientele classes.
I make one very quick point. So there's a double schizophrenia on the diversity is our strength, multiculturalism is our strength crowd. One of them is the obvious one that, diversity is our strength, yet it exists on, yet the community relations exist on such an existential knife edge that conflict in the Middle East. Like the London mayoral office literally put out statements after October 7th saying, now, as we know, in times of things,
don't do anything crazy.
Things in London can flare up. So on the one hand, it can't be our strength if it requires a battery of legal reinforcements and propagandistic reinforcements to hold the tapestry together. But there's also there's a schizophrenia on this point as well, just speaking in purely fiscal terms. If Muslim immigrants into this country really were making a massive net fiscal contribution,
why do they need
our money to live closer to mosques? Presumably they're rich enough, well-heeled enough in the way that, say, Russian immigrants into Britain will be. Like, no one's angling for Russian immigrants to be closer to vodka shops or wherever Russians might want to be, So, and that's because Russian immigrants here, they've all had their assets seized now, obviously, but they're going to be making a massive net fiscal contribution, assuming they're paying tax and not dodging it. And so, he's speaking out of both sides of his mouth.
I mean, he's conceding that we're importing dependence.
Yes, of course.
That's what he's saying.
And it's our strength.
Yes, which is his strength.
Well, quite. Yeah.
If you appreciated that episode from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content that's on the site, such as the Epoch series, this episode on Gaius Gracchus. If you'd like to find out what else is being put out, you can follow on Twitter at lotuseaters_com on Twitter. Thank you and goodbye.